Welcome to the Modern .NET Show. Formerly known as the .NET Core Podcast, we are the go-to podcast for all .NET developers worldwide, and I am your host, Jamie GaProgMan Taylor. In this episode, I spoke with Scott Hunter about the dynamic world of .NET, open source, and a bunch of related technologies that Microsoft have released. Things like DevContainers.
Yeah, so I would tell people that listen to this, please check out DevContainers. I waited way too long to check them out. I knew they existed for a long time and just was too busy and never actually dug deep into it. And now that I have, it's a really, really cool feature.
Along the way, we touch on the fact that .NET is not just open source, but actively accepts contributions from the wider development community, something unheard of in the .NET Framework days. As an example, .NET 7 has had over 1,000 contributions from the developer community, and that's not counting the changes that Microsoft's engineers made to it. We also touch on some advice that Scott has for participating in open source communities, along with some hints as to how Microsoft helps to lead the community around their open source projects. There's some great advice here from someone who works in enterprise-led open source every day. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and we'll dive into the core of modern .NET. So, Scott, this is an amazing, it's a huge honor for me to have you on the show. I never would have guessed 6 years ago when I was sitting in a coffee shop going, maybe this should be a podcast about .NET Core, that I'd actually A, be sitting talking to you, or B, that we'd run into each other at MVP Summit. It's a real honor for me, so thank you very much.
I'm super happy to be here, and I'm glad that we found each other at the MVP Summit and we're able to talk and schedule this. And I'd love to come back more than once. Huge .NET fan, and I appreciate people like yourself that are talking about it all the time. That makes me super happy.
You're very, very welcome. I'm a huge fan of .NET myself. It isn't the first thing that I ever learned to program in, but it's the first thing that I've done that I did any sort of enterprisey stuff with. I actually go all the way back to assembler at college, so over here in the UK, at the age of about 16. I got plonked down in front of a Motorola 68K and was booted into DOS. I wasn't booted into DOS, the computer we were using. Sorry, I need to be a little bit clearer. And they were like, hey, here is assembler, make it do some stuff. So, from that directly into .NET was a bit of a jump.
I made a bigger jump because I first learned assembler as well, 6502. And then oddly enough in college, assembler came back up again. In my case, it was on an IBM 360, 370 mainframe. And assembler on a mainframe is like .NET, honestly. I mean, the registers are all so big. They're 128 bits that you don't have to do any carryover or any of the crazy stuff that you do in assembler and on smaller architectures. But funny story for me is after that, I the first thing I worked on was a BBS called Wildcat, and it was written in Turbo Pascal. And that's just kind of weird because of my .NET roots, because, who knows that, X number of years later, I'd be working for the same company where Anders Hallsberg works. Anders Hallsberg, for people that don't know, is the creator of Turbo Pascal and C# and TypeScript. And so there's weird combos of how the paths intersect. But I went through C++ first at Enterprise, and then moved to .NET after that, and a small stint of Java there as well. We had one product that was written in Java that we had acquired, and so you acquire something and it just is what it is. But of all those, I will tell you that the most productive and the thing I've enjoyed the most is definitely .NET. We've kept making it modern, which keeps it up to date.
Sure. And I think that's one of the most exciting things for me is that, I try to learn about other languages as well as the one that I'm using for my day-to-day stuff, because I feel like, my personal opinion, that sometimes it can be dangerous just to stay in one language or framework. And so I'm looking around at what Java's doing. I'm looking around at what's happening in the JavaScript ecosystem. I'm looking at what's happening with Go and Rust and things like that. And I do genuinely feel like you said, .NET is staying as modern as it can be, right? There are things in there that there are things in .NET that JavaScript has only just got hold of, right? The Python's only just got hold of. We've had async await for a long time. It's a new thing to a lot of Python developers, at least built in to Python and JavaScript developers. So it's always good to find out what other people are doing, I think.
We are always looking at what other folks are doing. That is part of the evolution of .NET. Like in many cases, I've sat down comically enough at the MVP Summit with a bunch of MVPs, and they're like, hey, why did you do all this work to get rid of main? Why did you do all this work to change the way you write APIs and all this stuff? We said, we don't understand it. We're never going to use that. And I told them, I said, well, that stuff wasn't done for you. That stuff was done for the next generation developer. So our assumption today is you're going to learn either in high school or in college. You're likely going to learn Python and JavaScript. And so if you learn one of those languages and then you come and start using .NET, we actually, I don't know if you heard the story, but we actually, Maria on the team did interviews with Python developers and JavaScript developers and had them go through a .NET tutorial and saw where they struggled and asked them for feedback on what they thought. And they're like, why all this work just to get to my code? Because in both of those languages, you just start writing code. You don't put all this structure around the outside of the thing to get started. And so that work is all being done to basically say if you come from these other languages, .NET doesn't look too alien to you. I mean, even like for the team knows I hate this word, minimal. For the new declarative API syntax, the first versions of that required a whole bunch of typecasting and stuff like that, which for .NET people were used to. But Matt Torgerson on the team was able to go and make the compiler automatically typecast for you. It actually is doing that behind the scenes. So you're not writing the typecast. The typecast are still being put in there. But that was all being done. So if you came from one of these languages, .NET looks simple to you. And I think that's super critical to the language. And it's funny, we all laughed a few months ago when we saw Java. The next version of Java is stealing some of that stuff as well. So they're cleaning up their main as well. I don't think they're going to go all the way as far as we did and get rid of main, but they are going to simplify the parameters and a bunch of other stuff. So we all saw the pull request into Java to try to do the same thing that we're doing. And I think it's all of the older languages and older platforms should always be looking at what the newer platforms are doing and take the best from that. Even when we did MVC in .NET Framework, Ruby on Rails had been out for a while, and so in many cases we all wrote Ruby code, and then we learned. And so to me, ASP.NET MVC was an evolution of Ruby on Rails. It was better because the next thing's always better than the first thing.
Sure.
Like both you and I, if we look at any code we wrote 5 years ago, we'll hate it. Because we're probably continually getting better as developers, and we go back and go, that's awful. Why did I write it that way?
Sure. And I think, okay, so you use the word stealing, but obviously it's as a sort of silly way to describe it. But I think it's very, like you said, it's very important for all languages and all framework designers and things like that to look around and say, oh, cool, they're doing it this way. Can I adopt it into the way that my thing works? And I think, at least from my perspective, the most important thing about that reduction of the, I don't want to say cruft, but the reduction of the extra stuff that needs to go around your code to make say a hello world or to make a minimal API or something like that. It's not like it's being removed and you can't do that ever again. It's at the moment, at the very least, the way that I've been playing with the preview bits and all that kind of stuff is, if I want to have that stuff removed, I can, right?
So the reality is how that tech actually works. We actually inject a main anyways. You just don't see it. So whatever's gone is still really actually there. We just did it all behind the scenes for you. And I don't know if I used the word stealing, but we all steal from everybody, by the way. So like async and wait, which was something that was created back in the .NET Framework 3.5 time frame. Almost every language out there has got a version of that today, because basically that was just an example of I don't know if we got lucky or what, but it's threads are hard, and it's just a much better way of writing thread code when you can actually follow it straight down versus having it a bunch of forks and stuff like that. And so anytime a language has some major breakthrough, all the other languages will steal or borrow or whatever you want to call those capabilities, and so that's just part of it. And there's a cool event in Seattle that's coming up on I think September 19th, where Anders Halsberg, the creator of Python, James Gosling, the creator of Java, and the lady who designed Smalltalk are all getting together and talking as language designers together. And so what I'll tell you is you find that these people, even though they have very different opinions and thoughts, they're all still friendly people and just love to talk languages and nuts and bolts. And so it's, I as you said, I don't think the words like steal or that those words are too strong. It's more of everybody learns, and all the languages get better all the time because we're all looking and changing and trying ideas.
Absolutely, 100%. Because we all know from our depending on which direction we came from in this industry, you may know, obviously you and I will, but the listener may know that there is no one way to solve a problem. And so you get a bunch of people together who've solved a similar problem in different ways. You can all take inspiration from that, can't you?
I will tell you, if you gave me a bunch of Excel files and told me to go scrape some code out of them, do some transformations, and make a new file, I would not do that in .NET. I would do that in Python. Python is dang good at that, and so, as you said, you use the tool for the job. .NET happens to be great for building web applications and desktop applications and API backends. It is not the language that I would go use to glue a bunch of stuff together, or the platform. And so, and I hope the .NET team would agree with me on that. I think they would.
No, I think that's a very, very good statement and a very fair statement to make, because I feel like in my own experience of working with a lot of devs across I've only really been doing this for 14 years, so not a great deal of time. But in my experience, I've met a lot of people who are very, I can't think of the right word, but they're very, I worry that evangelical is the wrong word, but they're very much, we have to do it in this particular framework or this particular language or this particular setup because that's what we need to do it in. And I'll walk in and say, well, actually, if you investigated, Rust or Dart or Go or Python or JavaScript or, there's likely a package in a different language for this, and you may not have to put in as much effort, But I feel like there's a lot of, maybe stick-to-itedness is probably the right word. I don't know, but there's a lot of people who are like, no, we'll do it this way.
I've seen the same thing, and I wonder if it's more of your and my generation that are like that. And I don't think the newer generations are the same as us that have the super strong, the crazy strong, I must do everything in this one way. Like at Microsoft, what I would say when I joined Microsoft, a lot of our customers were what I would call a Microsoft shop. All they use is Microsoft products. I don't see that there's not that many that are that way now. Most people, or most companies that I see in my professional, working, are on purposely not putting all their eggs in one basket for valid reasons. And so, so I do think it is you're right that especially my generation, I think, is super biased towards whatever their favorite language is, and are kind of hostile to exploring others. Like if I'm going to write a rule for a API management, transformation, JavaScript is probably the easier language to do in that little small place where I have a couple lines of code. So I'll say I've gotten wiser, and so I will not be full bias towards .NET, but it's still my preferred.
Sure. And like you said, there's nothing wrong with having a preferred, but knowing that the other tools exist means that you don't fall into that pit of, I think it was Abraham Maslow who said, that when everything you've got's a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When all you have is .NET, then all you can do is .NET solutions, and there's nothing wrong with a .NET solution. But like you said, a JavaScript or a Python or something may be better for the situation you're in.
Definitely.
Cool. Okay. So I want to say that I feel like I'm one of the lucky .NET devs in that I get to play with all of the new things as they're coming out. Partially because I'm an MVP, but partially because I'm a curious kind of a chap. But I do know that there's a lot of enterprisey devs who are in the .NET space who maybe don't get the chance or don't have the time outside of work to actually work on or look at the new stuff. So I do know a lot of enterprisey devs, and it has become a bit of a joke within within my circles anyway, of, wait, you can run .NET on Linux now? And lots of things like that. So I was just wondering, would you be able to maybe mention and talk about some of the 10,000 foot differences between if I'm coming to .NET new and I'm saying, well, I've got .NET Framework, I've got .NET Core, and I've got .NET 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, where do I start? So I wonder, could you just real quick just rattle off a few of those?
Sure. First off, you mentioned Linux, and Linux is something that is super important to us. We started the journey that it makes .NET what .NET is today back about 2013. When we realized that because of the backwards compatibility requirements for .NET Framework, there was not a way to go forward, meaning that we can never change anything in .NET Framework, because you have to realize that .NET Framework is included in every Windows installation. And so every machine contains a copy of .NET. If we make a breaking change, it breaks apps all across Windows. And trust me, as somebody that works in the team, we had repeated cases where we broke big stuff across the years. And so, so a couple things there was, number one is we also saw that in the server world, especially the web backend world, there was already in 2013 this big move to Linux. And so we deemed that to be critical for the platform, that, hey, if the world's moving to Linux and .NET's not, we're going to get left behind. And we expanded that because we actually took that to, we support Mac OS, and we've added architectures like ARM64, ARM32 as well to the platform. And all those are about those same kinds of things. It's like, hey, the industry's moving, just like we're talking about languages. Well, the industry's always shifting and moving. And so Linux has had this, this slow rise. And even at Microsoft, you've probably heard us say that the Azure customers, more than half are now using Linux. And so that's a huge accomplishment. So we as a team, thought those were all super important things. Number one, if you want to take a bet on a platform, it needs to be open source. Why does it have to be open source? Because in many cases, if you're in the industry as long as I've been, people keep old apps around for a long time, and maybe the framework they built on is out of date, and they have to maintain some of it themselves. And so they want the platform to be open source. Obviously, we talked about Linux. That's a huge important thing forward. And that was the genesis of what started off being .NET Core. And at the time, .NET Core had to have a new name because it wasn't .NET Framework. .NET Framework was something we'd been shipping since 2002. And so we started off with a brand new name. And then we in my terms, we got lucky. Most of the times when you reinvent a tech, you lose half of your audience. We did not. We actually gained audience, not lost audience, or we got people back. We heard many stories of people that actually moved off of .NET to Java because of Linux. And then they're like, oh my gosh, you've got .NET on Linux now. We can come back. I was at MVP summits and at build conferences, and I would get hit in the hallway all the time by people that thanked us for letting them move back to .NET. And so we did the .NET Core thing for version 1, version 2, version 3. And, because we had so much uptake on the platform, I think because of performance, because of the fact you could put multiple versions on the same machine, we fixed a bunch of those things where an update on your machine would happen, it would break your applications. I think we got in the OS support, we got the right mix of things that caused people to be motivated to move to the new platform. And once we saw that we were going to be successful, that's when in .NET 5, we skipped 4 because we had .NET Framework 4. We didn't want to have .NET Core 4, .NET Framework 4. That's kind of a confusing message. Or even .NET 4 and .NET Framework 4. So we skipped 4 completely and said, we'll just go right to 5. And we rebranded the platform as .NET 5 and dropped the core. Because really going forward, the version of .NET I want customers to use is .NET 5, 6, 7, 8. Don't build new applications on .NET Framework. I mean, you can, but really, all the new capabilities and features are only going to be in the new platform. And so we wanted our message to be moving forward. If you're brand new to the platform, sadly, you're going to see some of that history, but I wish you would just, if you're a JavaScript developer and you came, you go, oh, there's .NET 7 and there's .NET 8, and you don't know all the history. It's the negative of being a 20-year-old platform is, we've gone through the changes. But so I would tell most folks, if you're building brand new apps, do them on the newer .NET. But the old .NET framework will be there forever. It's part of Windows, and we're never going to break those applications. And we still make subtle changes in it. We a year or so ago, we ported .NET Framework to ARM64. ARM is a big thing that I'm super excited about. I've done a lot of work this year trying. Apple introduced the M1 Macs, the Apple Silicon Macs that have battery life that is just much better than being on an Intel or AMD processor. Last year, we shipped a developer kit for developers where you could go and buy it. It's a Mac Mini style device running an ARM chip. We have some ARM laptops. They're not the greatest yet, but they're going to keep getting better. And I think even on the Windows side, the ARM stuff is going to be super important. And so I spent a lot of time this year. Well, what if you're on an ARM machine and you want to publish to an x64 machine? How do you do that? And so we've been modifying the Docker files in VS Code. We'll do them in Visual Studio as well. So our Docker files are now cross-architecture is what I would say. You can be on one architecture and publish to another. So, but that's kind of the journey from .NET, .NET Framework to .NET Core to .NET. And our hope was to have just a unified platform, which is just, hey, I'm a .NET developer.
Sure. And there's a whole bunch to unpack there, but I just want to talk really quick about the ARM64/M chip stuff for Apple, because I'm one of these people who has one of those Apple devices. In fact, I'm communicating using one right now. I've got this Mac Air M2, and it astounds me that I was able to just go to, the .NET website, which I think is .net, .net, and just download the SDK, and it just runs. And this is effectively in the scheme of CPU architectures, a brand new CPU architecture. And I could go .NET new, and there it is. It's right there. That just astounds me.
I feel the same way, and I am on a Apple Silicon device as well. I actually, it's funny, I was telling some people that were staying at the house recently that I've been primarily using Apple Silicon for this year. And you might ask, well, Scott, why are you doing that? And I'm making sure that all the tools that my team builds, I work on a team called the Azure Developer Experience Team. We build something called the Azure Developer CLI, AZD. We build a bunch of the VS Code extensions for Azure. We build a programming framework called Dapper that helps build microservices, especially cross-language microservices, where you might have a .NET microservice calling a Java microservice or vice versa. And I make sure that all of our tools work on the ARM tech. And I'm doing that for two reasons. One, I want to make sure that all of our tools work everywhere. I don't, modern Microsoft, we don't care what, whether you're on Linux or you're on Apple or you're on Windows, we don't really care. But I want to make sure all of our tools work great on ARM64 devices, because I believe we're going to see a lot more of these ARM devices in the future. And I want to make sure all my tech is ready day zero. And that's why, one of the things you would struggle with today if you went to VS Code and built a .NET API and added a Docker file to it, the Docker file it's going to generate by default is going to build an ARM container for you. And you're then not going to be able to publish that to things like Azure, because it's going to go, no, we want an x64 container. It might already be live. I've not tried it, but we've done the work in VS Code now where your debug builds will be on the same architecture as your local machine, but your production builds will actually be x64. You can configure this in a file inside of VS Code, but we're making the tools architecture aware as well. So I can take my Apple Silicon ARM device, and I can build an x64 container and publish it to Azure. That's the nirvana that we want to get to, and it should be out today. If you're on the current version of VS Code, you've got me curious now. I'm going to try it and see if it's fixed. But I know my team made the PRs a few weeks ago to update the Docker files, and so we learned that the Docker files were written wrong. And so it comes back another way too, is we've had people ask, hey, Azure DevOps pipelines, do you have any ARM devices there? I'm like, you don't need ARM devices there. With these same new style Docker files, I did an episode of the ASP.NET Weekly Stand-Up where I talked about this with Richard Lander in detail. With the properly written Docker file, you can build an ARM container on an x64 Azure DevOps pipeline or a GitHub action that's running on x64 devices as well. So with a proper Docker file, there's a platform environment variable that you can actually use in a Docker file. You can make all this stuff work. And so one of my goals is to make you successful on your ARM hardware. And as I said, we ship that Windows device for developers, and I assume we're going to ship more Windows devices for developers. And so it was fun all last year using a Windows ARM device too, which is just as quiet as the Apple Silicon device you're using now.
Yeah, I really like that, because it feels very much like it doesn't matter what I build on, right? I think it was your colleague Scott Hanselman who said in one of his videos, use what you like. Yeah, I think he was talking about like line endings for files and file editors. Use what you like. And I love this idea of being able to use whatever supported hardware I want to make the changes to the code in order to then push it and have some builder, Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions, whatever, build my thing, deploy it to where it needs to be deployed in the format it needs to be running in. I love that, because then I don't then need to be carrying around a 17-inch, weighs 300 pounds. You won't get a laptop that weighs 300 pounds, but you know what I mean. I don't need to be carrying around a huge amount of equipment just to be able to make a single line change to push up to wherever to then fix the problem, right?
It's crazier than that, though, Jamie. Today I could take an iPad and create an entire environment with code spaces. I could basically just go to a URL. I could go to my repo in GitHub, click a button in the browser on an iPad with a keyboard, and go make that same code change. I mean, that to me is the crazy part of the world that we live in today. Is I have a variety of options. There's I'd love to come back and talk about all these developer options. Like there's a feature in VS Code called DevContainers. So one of the things that I hate the most as a developer is, and you're probably just like me, my machine is sacred. I'm afraid of putting something on my machine that I can't take back off my machine. And so, super sacred for me is being able to keep my machine exactly like I want it. And so DevContainers is a cool feature in VS Code where it creates a Docker container and you actually are developing inside the container. And so inside that container, I could install the SQL Server a container image. I could install MySQL, Postgres, Redis, whatever. And I know that when I'm done, I close VS Code, all that goes away. And my machine never had a MySQL or a SQL Server or a Postgres or a Redis or Grafana ever installed on top of it. And so I assume you're like me. I try to all extends not to do stuff that globally affects my machine, especially to work on one project. If I work on a project and it installs a bunch of junk in my box, I'm like not happy.
No, I
Have you
agree.
tried
I agree.
DevContainers?
I have not tried it yet, but it's on my list of things to try because I work as a freelancer. So I'm, every couple of months, every couple of years, I'm moving from project to project. And so, like you said, I'm making global changes to my machine every time I open a different project for a different client, a different whoever. And so, it's sometimes even small things like node version changes. Now, I know that NVM exists, but I shouldn't have to know that it exists, right? I should just be able to go, here's my project, figure it all out, computer. And then like you said, I close the app and then boom, all of those dependencies are gone. I love that.
That's what DevContainers does. So my team in Microsoft, we built some best practices for how to build applications for Azure. And we built the .NET one first, of course, because it's, I'm Sky Hunter. And it's called the .NET Reliable Web App Pattern. You can just Google that and you will find that code. But we also just released a Java version of it. And of course that requires, I'm a hands-on person, so I like to test all of the stuff that we build. And the Java one is built inside of a dev container. And so literally I can go and pull the project from GitHub, open it up in VS Code, tell it to open the developer container. It installs a version of Ubuntu in that dev container. It installs Java in that container. It installs all the stuff required for the app to work. And then, as I said, when I'm done, I close the container and I walk away, and my machine never was touched for that. And so I'm like you. If I'm going to do, I'd want a Node thing to do the same kind of thing. I don't want to use what version of Node my customer wants on my local machine. I want to use the LTS, but I'm happy to, in a dev container, use whatever version of Node my customer would want.
That's pretty cool. I do like that because I know that there are some different attempts at doing something similar in the Linux on the desktop space. But obviously that requires you to have a Linux on your desktop. I think things like Fedora Silverblue, but there's a lot of stuff missing from my most recent exploration of those. There's a lot of things missing because the way that my understanding of the way that it works is every single dependency you take is installed as a separate container on your machine, and messages are then API calls are then redirected. But the problem is that the IDEs don't know that because they're in a separate container. And so when you're running, say, Visual Studio Code and you say, hey, .NET run, it goes, .NET's not installed. And then you open a terminal and go, .NET run, and it runs, right? So there's a little bit more work from those folks to wire those things up. But I love this idea of just having something set up in my Visual Studio Code repo, in my repo that I'm loading with Visual Studio Code. I load it. Maybe I need to do some work, I don't know, but it just takes over. It goes, hang on a minute, let me just deal with all of this for you. Here's all of your stuff. Here's your environment running in your container. You hit F5 or whichever keyboard shortcut you've got set to run the thing in Visual Studio Code, and it just runs, and you've got effectively nothing installed on your machine. I like that.
That's exactly how it works. And so you can, if you install if you go to VS Code and go to the extension tab and search for dev container, you click that, then bring up the command palette and type dev container, and there'll be a create, and the create will then ask you what language do you want to use. And .NET will be in the list. You could select .NET, and you could say .NET 5, and then it's going to ask you what OS do you want to use. It's probably going to default to Ubuntu, and you press return a couple times, and then like today I would not have .NET 5 installed on my machine, but using dev containers I could easily go and develop on .NET 5 all inside that container without touching my global machine at all.
Right. And I think that's the most important thing, right? Is because .NET 5, as we're recording this, is out of support. So, like, if there is an application which has that requirement, that hard requirement, no, we're on .NET 5, we can't upgrade for whatever reason, you don't want to, I don't want to have to click through all of the different pages on the .NET website to try and find the installer, to then find that it's a minor version out and go, no, I've got to go back through that loop of looking for the right version of the controls and the right version of the software development kit and the right version of everything. Then finally we get there. It's taken me 2 hours. It may not take me 2 hours. I'm obviously over exaggerating. I get to that point, it's done, and then I make my single line change. I then test it locally and push it up to source control, and I'm done. But it's taken me 2.5, maybe 3 hours to get there. I don't want that.
Yep. Yeah, so I would tell people on the listen to this, please check out DevContainers. I waited way too long to check them out. I knew they existed for a long time and just was too busy and never actually dug deep into it. And now that I have, it's a really, really cool feature.
Cool. If you're enjoying this show, would you mind sharing it with a friend or colleague? Check out Podcatcher for a link to the show notes, which has an embedded player within it and a transcription and all that stuff, and share that link with them. I'd really appreciate it if you could indeed share the show. But if you'd like a few other ways to support it, you could leave a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. So if you head over to .netcore.show/review, you'll find loads of ways to do that. You could consider buying the show a coffee. The Buy Me a Coffee link is available on each show's show notes page on the website. This is a one-off financial support option. You could become a patron. This is a monthly subscription-based financial support option, and the link to that is included on each episode show notes page as well. I'd love it if you could share the show with a friend or colleague, or leave a rating or review. The other options are completely up to you and are not required at all to continue enjoying the show. Anyway, let's get back to it. So, I do have a question relating to open source stuff. I know that there's a lot of, as the date of recording, there's a lot of discourse about .NET and open source. I'm going to try and avoid that because I feel like a conversation for another time and for people who are way smarter than me. Happy for you to go into that if you want, Scott. But so my question is essentially twofold. I've got a question from the community, from my good friend Scott. So this is going to get confusing because he's called Scott and you're called Scott. So we can do that one first if you like.
Let's do it.
And sure, okay. So I will include Scott's entire full background of the question in the transcription in the show notes, but essentially he says that he absolutely loves the fact that the .NET team, and especially you, were quite open about what we're doing. I said we there. Obviously, I'm not part of that, any of the Microsoft teams, but it's what's going on, what's being built, and what directions everyone's taking, and that's pretty cool. And he also says that he notices that the comments area, which he is happy and glad exists, but he sees that there's a lot of critical stuff there from frustrated people. Why can't you do this? Why did you do that? Why did you do the other? And first off, he wants to applaud everyone who writes those blog posts and everyone who jumps in to maybe respond to those messages. Because obviously it's difficult to maintain a cool outlook and be, supportive and accepting of someone who's maybe at a pain point or maybe just venting their frustration, but without responding in anger or anything like that. So, I appreciate it too. And he's saying, he really appreciates all of you for saying stuff like that. But the crux of his question is essentially, with all of the projects that perhaps you've been involved in or that you're involved in writing up, or the people that you work with and the people who work for you have been involved with, especially those in a position like yourself who are public about what's happening, how do you deal, like, on a personal level? And I maybe this is a bit too personal for the podcast, but like on a personal level, how do you or the rest of the team deal with these people who are coming to you with these perhaps negative reactions to these things? And does it ever make anyone anticipate those negative feedback when you're about to release a new product or announce a new product. I feel like that's more of a software development and being public question than a .NET question, but I like it. And if you're okay with answering it, then I'm happy to skip it if you like. That's not a problem.
No, I'm happy to try. I think it's bigger than open source. I'm not sure it's even an open source question. So let me give you my angle on this, which is, obviously .NET's a huge project, and but if you ignore .NET and we just, as you said, just think about the entire open source ecosystem, I'm going to say step back a little further. Let's talk about social media. When we started rebooting .NET back in 2013, we did, we talked openly on Twitter. Was primarily the main place that we as a team were. There's two places the team represented itself. I would say it was Twitter and GitHub. YouTube is part of that as well. But especially, I would say sometimes, and I'd hate to talk about politics, but in the era of Donald Trump in America, we found that these social media platforms became places for hate, places for false information, places for you just made up crap, and the reality is, unfortunately, that all these places are places where that can happen. I could go on Twitter and say, hey, we're going to do this new feature for AOT for .NET, and maybe I get attacked, maybe I don't. I'll make it worse. I'm going to go really deep in, Jamie, and get myself in trouble. If I'm a woman, my chance of attack is probably higher. If I'm a woman of color, then my chance is probably even higher. And so that's the tough thing is I grew up in an era when these communities felt like they were kinder, gentler communities, and they've gotten much harsher. We have an entire team at .NET in Microsoft and .NET. There's a team, we call it the 911 community team, and they're the part of our organization that deals with whenever one of these things, kind of happens in the social media or happens in GitHub. And you might if people are looking for an example, let's say that you feel very strongly that we should change some API, some direction. And so what kind of happens is various people inside the team will look and go, does this change go in the direction that .NET's actually moving in? So in many ways, Microsoft's the benevolent dictator. And you need a benevolent dictator in open source project. You just can't have pure chaos because, just imagine if you're like in Teams or some application, if just random buttons just started showing up because, Bob likes a button, Jane doesn't like a button. You have to have some control here. And so, when people don't get the way they want, sometimes it can turn nasty. And so I said, we have a team that actually looks at this because we're also trying to prevent that hate from being in our communities. We want the .NET community, especially things like GitHub, to be safe places and comfortable places for all developers. But there is no magic answer for that. We've set clear codes of conduct in our repos, and we have people in that alias I was mentioning before, whose job is to make sure that the feedback and stuff in those communities is being held that direction. But I feel bad because, as you said, if you're a developer and you just happen to go look, hey, I'm interested in this part of the .NET networking stack, and then you might run into one of these, kind of nasty conversations, and you're like, eek, what the heck is this? I don't know. These .NET people don't seem that nice. I've just come to accept it. And as I said, what I would tell anybody doing open source is build a code of conduct that you think, and you can, borrow from many of us that have worked on these things for many, many years, and just enforce them. And I think it's just it's I don't know, it's kind of the negative of the world we're in today, where these social communities, because there's no filters anywhere, can just get out of hand. I don't know if that's where you were looking to go, but that is kind of my belief on it, and I hope that helps.
Sure, yeah. I think it certainly helps from what I understood of other Scott's question, because there was something in there about do you have any advice for people who are getting into open source development or development full stop to perhaps attempt to not nullify but reduce the effects of that? And I think from my perspective, I think you're right. If you set those expectations from the ground up of we expect people who interact with this project to behave in this certain way and to provide this this kind of environment for everyone involved, I think that it's important, and I feel like it's necessary. It shouldn't be necessary, you're right, but I feel like it is necessary. I mean, we even have one for this podcast. I don't think we need one, but it's on the website. There is a code of conduct for interacting with the podcast, not for guests, but for people who might be like, oh, I didn't like what Jamie said on this episode. We'd better, and it feels like a necessary step, but that it maybe shouldn't be. But there you go. That's my own personal opinion.
It's just there's lots of people in the world, and that's most conferences have code of conducts, and I've been around too long, and so because of that, I've actually heard why some of those code of conducts exist. I've heard about the incidents that occurred in the audiences at some of these conferences and stuff like that before. So it's, I think in most cases, if you're doing open source, you're not going to see a lot of that. .NET is high profile because it has millions of users, and so it might see more of that than if you and I went out and wrote our own image library or audio processor or something like that. Even myself, I use a really cool open source project called Homebridge. And what that does is that takes, let's say you've got a Ring camera and you want that to appear in like HomeKit on an Apple device. It bridges that gap. And so I contribute to that community all the time, and I don't see the hate there, but I think it's because it's just a smaller subset of people, in our case, that are super home automation kind of oriented people. So I think it just depends on the scale and the size of the project. It's just like, that's why Major Politics has, even crazier followers and stuff, because that's not millions, that's hundreds of millions.
Yeah, I think, not to belabor the point, but I feel like when you get a large enough collection of people together, the percentage of, I'm worried about saying this, but bad actors, I feel like that in some respects plays down what happens, and in some effects plays up what happens, but the percentage of those people goes up. It goes up. and with .NET being, like you said, as big as it is, you likely see that more than, say, I do with one of my open source projects, because there's like 5 people who use it. My project, that is.
Yep, that was my meta point was, I feel bad that people have to see that stuff, but it is out there, and as I said, there's a whole team at Microsoft that tries to control that as best we can. But that's we can't see it all. It has to be reported to us to even find out in some cases.
Sure. So, let me think of how to put this. So, .NET's open source, and it's not an accusatory, but why? Right? Because wasn't everyone happy with .NET Framework being shared source and like closed source for most of us?
No, it is interesting to think about how the world's always evolving, because .NET Framework was built back in 2002. I don't even think I even heard the word open source back in 2002. It was open source was just becoming a thing before I joined Microsoft, and I remember hearing about open source primarily from Linux. Linux was one of the things that was open source back in that era that we had friends that were looking at. But I think the big thing in why does it matter that .NET's open source? I think it comes down to Scott Hanselman and I, lots of Scotts, we were actually doing a European tour back in 2013, and we were super curious. We tried to do a stealth series of meetings to go ask people, what tools they were building their applications with. And unfortunately, it got out that we were doing this, and some of the fans showed up. We didn't want the fans. We just wanted to hear the raw thing. We heard enough raw stuff, and we had companies that told us that they were more than happy to use closed source operating systems. They were more than happy to use closed source office suites. But for the stuff they were building for their companies, they wanted that stuff to be open source. And some of the reasons that would be cited for this is, well, what if we build a .NET 5 application and Microsoft ends support for it, but we don't want to get rid of the .NET 5 application? We want the ability to, go maintain that ourselves, or go ask somebody to maintain that for us for a longer period of time in the .NET lifecycle. We had a great customer in France that runs an ad platform, and they needed to tune .NET in ways that we would never tune it. We tune .NET for the general public, and there's some knobs and switches to tune it. They run it at an insane scale, and so they needed to modify the product. And so if it's not open source, they wouldn't have access to the code. They couldn't build the product themselves, and they wouldn't be able to go make those custom modifications. I am happy to say that they were great people, and they actually came to Redmond one time, and we actually took most of their changes, and they're actually in the product today. So it was like they battled prove those things. But open source really just comes down to, as I said, many companies, when they build an application, might keep it around for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and they need some kind of guarantee that if they had to go fix something in an out-of-support product, they could. Inside of Microsoft, we take it a step further. As we're building things like parts of the back end of Azure or whatnot, obviously we use open source too. We don't use any open source that we can't. If we use open source at Microsoft, we actually want to build it ourselves. So if we're going to go use your zip library code to or JSON.NET, let's use a very popular .NET one. If we're using JSON.NET in something, we're not going to go and download the JSON.NET NuGet package from NuGet.org. We are going to have a team that goes and builds it for us. And you might ask, well, why would you do that? Sounds crazy. Well, what if James Newton King is on vacation for 6 months and a major security issue happens in JSON.NET? Well, we want to know that because we've already built it all from source, we could fix it ourselves if we had to. And I don't think we're unique in that aspect. If you're making major dependencies on open source, you probably want to have the ability to go, hey, if something bad happened, we could do something in that space. But that was a trend that we started seeing in 2013, was just this general kind of like, and I think the reason this happens was back in the day there was a bunch of developer stacks that went out of support. And then, companies were stuck. And nobody wants to be stuck. I mean, it's scary. I still talk to at least once every 2 months. A big customer at Microsoft will come through and I'll be talking to them and they're still using mainframes. So software stays around for a long time. Mainframes, that means that code was probably written in 1960, 1970. Crazy that stuff's still around, but I see mainframes come up in our Azure calls all the time. But that's kind of why we did open source. The other thing for us, and .NET really surprised us, I think. We open sourced in 2014. The bits that would become .NET Core, and then .NET 7, .NET 8. But we get also tons of contributions from the community, and so we're only X number of developers. And I remember when I was first at Microsoft, I had to learn how to triage bugs for ASP.NET, and you would see bugs that would come through, and you're like, yeah, we could fix that, but should we? Meaning that we would stack rank based on priority. It's like, hey, this bug affects 10 million people or 20 million people. That's we're going to fix that first. Jamie's bug, well, it's a nice to have, but only Jamie's complaining about it. And open source changes that, where now Jamie can go and actually submit a PR to fix the bug. It's not as high a priority on our list. And so more of those bugs get through. We had a lot of fun during the early .NET Core days with the community helping us build the performance improvements. And so if you end up having it being an open source project with lots of momentum, then you get all these community contributions, and that really helps the product. And .NET's been blessed because we've had tens of thousands of community contributions to .NET over the last since 2013, 2014. So some mix of all that stuff kind of matters. But I think the wave started with people, if they're going to take a bet on something, they wanted to know that if the company behind what they took a bet on went away, that asset doesn't go away.
Sure. There's a couple of things that you'd said there that I'd love to sort of just cover real quick. One of them is the mainframes, and I know at the minute I think is it IBM are looking to figure out a way of converting COBOL to other languages, and I know that there's a COBOL for .NET stuff, because that, folks, go ahead and go to Google or Bing or whatever and go look into what COBOL is and why it's so important that we keep that code running. That's some scary stuff. But I like what you said about this. You said that there was a customer who needed to tweak some things, and now that they're able to tweak those things can be put back into the source code, and then I can use those things. Because there was a conversation I had, I want to say a year and a half ago, with some folks who were using .NET. They were using .NET 5, I think, at the time, to make an emulator for video games. Now, there's a gray area about emulators. I'm not going to talk about that. But this developer had said, essentially, we needed some performance stuff. We put a great case towards the maintainers. They added this performance stuff, and you get it for free, which I think is, for me, the biggest bonus of being part of an open source community is that I, as a .NET developer, when .NET 8 releases, which will be very soon as of when this episode releases, all of those performance increases, which we can maybe talk about in a moment, I get them for free. I don't have to do anything. I just go into my CS proj, I change it from .NET 7.0 to .NET 8.0, recompile, bang, my binaries are faster, they are smaller, they deploy quicker. All of this kind of stuff happens for free without doing anything comparatively, whereas you and everyone else over at Microsoft are doing the hard work, and the community is doing the hard work of how do we make this faster, how do we make this smaller, how do we make this, for want of a better phrase, fit on the head of a pin, right?
Yeah, that one of the things that I one of the benefits of being a .NET customer in many cases is this. We at Microsoft run .NET at insane scale levels. You would be surprised at how big the scale that we can run this platform at. And so I'll throw out a couple of fun things. So Microsoft Graph, this is how you talk to the M365 backend. It's written in .NET. 70 billion requests a day. Billion. Azure Active Directory, 185 billion requests a day.
Wow.
And so when you think about those numbers, we're running it at that scale. And so, as you said, you just get to just use the product, but your companies like Microsoft are running .NET at these crazy scales. That company in France runs it at the same types of scales as this as well. They're one of the higher ones. I'll give you examples of also that are fun. Is like that Microsoft Graph, 70 billion requests a day. When they moved to the latest version of .NET, their CPU usage went down by 37%, which means the cost of running the graph went down by 91%. Azure Active Directory, when they moved to the latest version of .NET, their CPU went down 67%. Once again, cost savings. Microsoft Teams moved to the newest version of .NET, 25% CPU reduction. So we are running .NET at insane scale inside of Microsoft, and then all of our customers get to reap the benefit of that. And we have other customers that sit out in the public that are running it at crazy scales as well, and they're making PRs into the platform. If you had told me 10 years ago that we could reduce CPUs 30% version over version over version, the performance delta between .NET Core 1.0 and .NET 7 is insane. So never would have ever expected those types of numbers. It makes me go, I didn't think .NET Framework was slow when I first developed in it. And and there's another cool thing. I've got I'm looking at a graph here from Stephen Tobe, who's one of the crazy engineers that works on .NET. .NET 5 had 250 plus performance improvements. .NET 6 had 550 plus performance improvements, and then .NET 7 had 1,000 plus. And so it's accelerating. It's not decelerating. It's actually accelerating, which is just crazy. I can't wait to see where it goes. In the future, like I'm looking at more performance stuff. For the Tech Empower benchmarks. Looking at the JSON benchmark, .NET 6 was 999K requests. .NET 7 is 1.16 million requests, up 16%. This was one I knew a whole bunch about, which is inserting multiple rows inside of EF Core. In .NET 6, that was 1.7 milliseconds. In .NET 7, that's 0.43 milliseconds. gRPC, Java 6. This is a open source. This is a person who runs their own gRPC benchmarks. Java 68.9K, Go 72.5K, C++ 89.4K, Rust 96.1K, .NET 99.8K. That's .NET 7. Those numbers are just crazy, and actually that's the benefit of open source as well as, using a framework running huge workloads and it becoming like Microsoft.
Sure. I have to admit, those numbers are very, very, very impressive. And I know that when I read Stephen Tobe's blog posts, about 5% of it makes sense to me, and the rest of it is like, these are numbers, I get this, but I don't know what this means.
Well, I think the crazier thing is, how many days does it take you to read the blog post? The .NET 7 performance blog post, it's not for the faint of heart. It's hundreds of pages. As you said, you understand some of it, and some of it's you don't understand, but it's all cool anyways. It's like full geek out material. He's an amazing engineer. That one of my fun anecdotes is we were doing probably .NET Core 1, and we had done research to go figure out how many people use data sets and data tables, which was the popular way of doing database operations in the .NET Framework world. And it ended up being a large number. And so we were asking ourselves, which APIs do we bring over? That was always a hard question back in the .NET Core 1 all the way through 3 days. And we decided to bring this thing over. And I'm talking to the engineering team, and they're like, yeah, it takes 3 or 4 weeks to get that ported over. And then I'm chatting with Tobe one night, and I wake up in the morning. When I say at night, I probably talked to Tobe 9:00 p.m. and I wake up at 7 a.m. and the code is sitting there. And so, he's a machine. He just, the bigger dev team thought it was going to be a couple of weeks worth of work or a month worth of work, and then he did it in a couple of hours. So that's the best part of working at Microsoft, is being able to interact with the people that we have here. It's just the David Fowlers and the Stephen Tobes, Damien Edwards, Scott Hanselman, Glenn Condron, Maria Nagaga, I could go on and on and on and on and on. It's my favorite part of my job is working, with all these crazy smart people. I would say Ginny Lawrence is a person in Azure services. Amazing. So that's the best part of coming to Microsoft is getting a chance to work with all these experts.
Awesome. So I know that there's lots of really exciting things coming with .NET 8, which is releasing very, very soon. If you're listening to this on the day of release, it is like a few days away. But I also know that you're very excited about AOT stuff. I'm wondering, could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, let me explain what AOT is. AOT stands for, first off, before we even explain what AOT is, let's explain how .NET works today. .NET is a JITted language. That stands for just-in-time compile. So what happens is, there's lots of benefits of this. So when you compile a .NET application, we don't actually generate x64 or ARM64 or ARM32 code. We just generate what's called IL. And then when you run the application, and the cool thing about this is because we don't generate any of that code, it means .NET runs everywhere. So what happens is when you boot up a .NET application on your Silicon Mac, the .NET runtime installed on your machine goes, oh, I'm going to go take this IL and I'm going to, as the code starts running, I'm going to convert it to the native machine language of my machine. In your case, it's ARM64. In the case of my Windows machine here, it's going to be x64. But it means .NET can run on all these platforms because it's not compiled to one platform. But notice I said just in time, which means as the app boots up, part of .NET boots up and starts converting this IL into machine code. That takes time. That means your app's going to start a little slower. The app might run faster in the long run because in many cases, let's say back to our C++ days, you compile that C++ code, it's compiled. It can never change. In a just-in-time environment, the jitter can go, wow, you've run this method 1,000 times. Maybe I should JIT it more optimized. It'll take me longer to do that, but I know you're going to run this 1,000,000 times, and so I can do that. And so a JITted language, while it starts slower, can actually perform faster than the statically compiled application in any cases. But what are the negatives of a JITted language? Number one, it's got a slow startup time. Number two, you have to have enough tech on the machine to compile the thing on the fly. So you have to have a .NET runtime installed that can do that. Another benefit of a JITted machine, though, a JITted application is development time is very fast. A C++ app, you have to compile the entire app statically. Every time you run it, that's slow. .NET, pressing an F5 in your editor typically is a second or so. But there's also this thing called AOT, which stands for ahead of time compile. In this case, you are making a binary that can run without anything on the machine at all. So that it supports what I would call self-contained. I can give you the app. You don't have to have .NET on your machine at all. The app will just run. Because the app doesn't have to JIT, it's going to start faster. And so what we find is some languages, some popular programming languages, things like Go and Rust, people compare .NET to that. And so there's always this huge spectrum of the other benefit of a AOT application is they're smaller in size. So if you build a Hello World in Go, you're going to get like a 10 meg executable. In .NET today, you're going to install a 60 or 70 meg runtime, and then you're going to run your code. Wow, that's 60 or 70 megs versus 10. So Go is popular for building command line tools today because of this self-contained thing. In fact, even my team built a tool called Azure Developer CLI in Go for that exact reason. So we've been doing AOT in .NET for a while. So if you've been using Xamarin or .NET MAUI, we are required in some cases to put native apps on devices. And so we actually do AOT those applications. If you've been using Blazor WebAssembly, that's kind of some AOT tech as well. We're compiling your .NET down into WebAssembly. And so we've been doing AOT all along, but it's been kind of a fringy thing. And in .NET 8, it's becoming more realistic. So for the first time ever, you'll be able to build a ASP.NET minimal API, and it will run AOT'd. And you might go, well, why does it all just run? Well, we all use these features called reflection in .NET. It's one of the most used things where the code can introspect the app and do stuff on the fly. So if you do things like routing inside of our web platforms, dependency injection, they're all using this. You can't do that with AOT because it's just machine code. You don't know what the heck it is. And so we have to make libraries inside of .NET AOT aware, where they can work in some of those cases. And so the team made a huge bunch of strides in .NET 8. And I've got an amazing slide that you unfortunately cannot see. But I will. I'll give you some cool examples. So we took an application, and it's a web app, and we compiled it without native AOT. And so I'll give you an example. So this is a Linux application. Its size was 88.3 megs. When it started up, it used 235 megs of RAM. It took 182 milliseconds to start up, and it basically was doing 650,000 requests a second. In .NET 8, if I AOT that, the size goes from 88.3 megs to 8 megs. The working set goes from 235 megs to 33 megs. The startup time goes from 182 milliseconds to 27 milliseconds. And the performance stays roughly the same. Now, don't get yourself excited and go, I'm going to AOT everything. AOTing is meant for special cases today when you need really fast startup time. You need a really small working set. But it's a journey in .NET. And as I said, .NET 8 will be the first version where we've got some of the web tech working inside of this stuff. And you'll see us as new .NETs come out, we'll keep expanding the amount of stuff that you can AOT. There's teams inside of Microsoft that actually care about some of this stuff. It's like maybe they're building some super microservice that has to start up very fast, or they have a lockdown machine that requires native code. But the cool thing is, we're going to get to the point where those same command line tools that you write in Go today, you could write them in .NET and get the same kind of size on disk benefits. And in many cases, you might ask questions like, well, why is .NET slower? Or why is that working set so big? Well, our garbage collector today is greedy. When the app first boots up, we go grab a bunch of RAM. So we're exploring in .NET 8 the first time having the garbage collector not be greedy, which will make the working sets go down. The cool thing for a .NET developer, if you're listening to this, is we're always evolving .NET, just like we talked about programming languages earlier, where we're always looking at what trends are happening in languages. We're also looking at things like, well, why did you build your command line tool with Go? Oh, because the single exe small size is important to you. Well, we want .NET to be good in all categories. We don't have to win all the categories, but we want to be a top 80% in every category, whether it's size on disk, startup time, working set. And to me, that's one of the benefits, as we talked about the entire podcast of .NET is, we could just stop and call it good. We're making it better every cycle. And so I'm excited for what's in .NET 8. If you really care about those performance characteristics in .NET 8, it might be more work to do it, but you can get there. In .NET 9, more stuff will work. And so it's kind of cool that you'll be able to choose, do you want the JIT world? Do you want the AOT world? And they both have their pros and cons. Like the AOT world is also going to be slower to compile because we have to make native code. But as I said, we used to close every .NET Conf with this. It's an exciting time to be a developer. I still believe it's an exciting time to be a developer, especially a .NET developer.
Nice. Those numbers are super impressive. Now, obviously, I can imagine, and we're running short on time, but I can imagine that was a specific app that was written in a specific way, and that there will be things that are being used in that app that you are supporting in AOT, right? You said earlier on there are bits that are not fully supported yet, and I guess whether I want to go down the route of AOT or not will depend on whether I'm using those bits that are not supported, right?
Correct. And the level of how important it is to you. Like for example, you might say the size on disk and the startup time is so important to me that I'm willing to put JSON.NET aside, and I'll do something different instead of using that package. I think our hope in the long run would be that I envision a future world where NuGet packages are marked, whether they're AOT safe or not, and so you could easily know what graph of stuff that you care about actually is AOT safe. Anything that uses reflection, as I said, will likely not be AOT safe, and the developer would have to make a version that does not use AOT as well. And that's what's happening in .NET is the team's looking at these things and building AOT aware versions of some of this stuff. Unlike in the Java world, there's something called Graal, and that's the Java version of being able to go do the same kind of thing. And once again, in the Graal world, there's just a bunch of stuff that doesn't work. And our hope in .NET is that we don't want to change .NET. We don't want the AOT thing to be like some 1% subset of .NET. We want it to be a much bigger part of that, and so that's why we're taking a slightly different approach than the Java folks are. But this matters to everybody. I think Twitter's an example of a platform that's written in Java that was then converted to Graal VM for performance reasons.
Awesome. Well, this has been an incredibly enlightening conversation, Scott. I thank you very much for being available to be on the show, and thank you for saying that you would as well. And I know you said earlier on that you'd love to be on again talking about all sorts of different stuff. What I would love to do, if you're okay with it, and I know I'm putting you on the spot by asking you in the episode, but I'd love to go away and play around with DevContainers and do some more stuff with all the different Azure tooling, and then come back to you again and say, hey, can't we talk about this? Would you be up for that?
I would love to. I would even take it further if you want to go further. If we want to do like a YouTube and actually have video and actually show us playing with DevContainers and stuff like that. I don't know if you're open to that kind of thing. I'll push you into the uncomfortable spot as well, but I'd be happy to do both a podcast and then one where we also recorded the video too and made that available.
Amazing. Let's figure that out.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, like I said, Scott, thank you ever so much for being available today and for being on the show. I really appreciate it. And I know that .NET 8, when this drops, is right around the corner. So, I want to wish you and the team the best of luck with all of that and everything going forward.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Modern .NET Show with me, Jamie Taylor. I'd like to thank this episode's guest, Scott Hunter, for graciously sharing his time, expertise, and knowledge. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at the podcast's website, that's .NETcore.show, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .NETcore.show/review for ways to do that, or check out our contact page at .NETcore.show/contact. And even possibly join our Discord server at .NETcore.show/Discord, all of which are linked in the show notes. But above all, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I hope that I'll see you again next time for some more .NET goodness. Let me do that one again. But above all, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I hope that I'll see you all again next time for more .NET goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.